Hey, George!
We're live.
George! You all right? Hey, what's the matter? Get out of here, Bert, or I'll hit you again. Get out of here. What the Sam Hill you yelling for, George? George? Bert, do you know me? Know you? You kidding? I've been looking all over town trying to find you. I saw your car piled into that tree down there, and I thought maybe you... Hey, your mouth's bleeding. Are you sure you're all right? What you... My mouth's bleeding, Bert! My mouth's bleeding! Zuzu's pedals! Zuzu... There they are! Bert! What do you know about that? Merry Christmas! Well, Merry Christmas! Merry! Merry!
I guess an angel has been born now. It's got its wings, not born, but got its wings. Welcome, everybody, to Beyond the Bay, sponsored by the Bay Theater in Suttons Bay, Michigan. We're a nonprofit, and we are here to help you educate you more and give you more knowledge and just have fun about film and cinema. So welcome today. I see people already stopping in. I see people, I see some people we have seen before, and so a couple new people popping in. So please chat. We're sponsored and we're a nonprofit. And today we have 3 guest panelists with us. It sounds like we have a 4th one down there too. And we'll take care of that in a second. So let's introduce our guest panelists and start out with Kevin Maher. Kevin Maher is a film industry professional. He's worked for studios such as Warner Brothers, MGM, and 20th Century Fox and Disney. And he now currently runs a top 10 films list blog and website. And he also is a programming team member here at the Bay Theater. So we welcome you. Thank you very much, Kevin, for joining us here today. Next is Ted. Ted Kroll is a member of our programming team here. He's a former film instructor at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. Also helped to set up and run a movie house or theater that is still operating today. And he is retired up here, and it does a good job in helping us with our program here. So thank you very much, Ted, for joining us again today. And I like your sweater. So hope everybody out there's got their holiday sweaters on too. So next is Rita. Rita Wessels. Rita Wessels began her interest in film back in watching old films on black and white TV back in the pre-cable TV days. She went on to start with her first job in high school, was working at a theater and continued working at the theater through college and for a couple years part-time afterwards after college. And today she lives retired up in Suttons Bay, Michigan, and she is a programming team member as well. So welcome, Rita. Thank you very much for being here. And we have somebody in the background as well. We have White Fang, a person who is actually running the questions and comments and watching what's going on. So as you're watching and see comments, that's coming from our volunteer who's playing White Fang today, and that's actually Zeke Smith. So we appreciate that very much, Zeke, for doing that. So today, what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about It's a Wonderful Life. And It's a Wonderful Life is a classic, was considered a holiday classic nowadays. And we have a lot to talk about that subject alone, whether it's a classic or not. But we want to have some fun today, and I see people coming in again still and discussing and chatting. So as you come in, how this works is basically will be that you'll see on the right of your screen or on the bottom of your screen someplace, what you're going to see is that a chat session. And what people will do is come in and chat with each other. Also, we really like it when you chat while we're discussing. So you put your comments out there, and we may pop your comments up and join the discussion or have you part of the discussion. And the third thing about that is while you're commenting, also we want like you to have questions. We have some questions prepared, but what we'd like to do is get questions from you so that we can answer those questions you might have or further interest you might have about this film. So that's how it runs. And to get everything started while some people are still getting in, what we do is we just ask all the panelists a first introduction question, a short one, about the film this film and how it's significant or not to film industry. We'd like to do right now is to first start out with asking Ted the question. And Ted, why is this film significant enough to remain a part of film history?
Well, before I do that, could you put back to the what you had before, the poster? Yeah, I just want to make a comment that they say it's a Christmas classic, but notice that when they first did the publicity for it, it has nothing to do with Christmas. And we can talk about that later. And this actual scene that they show of Stuart holding up Donna Reed is nowhere in the movie. So we can talk about that later. At any rate, the other thing I'd like to say about um, the film was not a success at first, and it disappeared. And it sort of why it became a classic was because the copyright was given up, and it started showing it on TV for free. The studios didn't have to pay any royalties, and little by little, people would see it, and the TV shows would show it on Christmas time, and it became a classic from underneath. I mean, a lot of times it's the critics that say it, or the studios make a lot of publicity. But this is one film that got to be popular, rising up from the public, really enjoying the film and seeing it on their own. And the fact of the matter is, it's certainly a well-made film. And one of Jimmy Stewart's best roles. And he adds some depth to his character coming after World War II. So that's the difference. And it's just got this great gimmick. It's sort of a gimmick of what would it be like if you didn't exist. How would your life be? And I think that's another reason it's very intriguing for people when they think of it that way. So there are a couple of things I throw in there. So that's.
Well, thank you, Ted. That's good. That's just the start, just to warm us up. That's good. All right. All right, Rita, what about you? Why is this film significant enough to remain a part of film history?
Well, I think Ted touched on a lot of the reasons why. And I think that had the film not had its rebirth, once it became public domain, it might not have achieved its level and status that it has now. And I think that was just a fortunate turn of events for the film. And I think what really resonated when it was widely released and widely seen is that it has a very positive message in the end that everyone can relate to. That, everyone's life is important. You touch many people throughout your life, and friends are the most important part of that. And I think that is a valuable lesson that we need reminding of throughout time. And I think that's why it's going to be a good film that's going to stick around a long time.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Rita. What about you, Kevin? Why will this film stand out or is significant to stay in film history?
Well, I think it's one of those films that has benefited by it evolving into a classic. As Ted mentioned, it sort of disappeared after its initial release and then was rediscovered in the 70s and 80s on television. And I think it plays perfectly that way because it's a film about nostalgia. And that nostalgia, looking back in the 70s and 80s to a time that's simpler and more honest and pure, as George's heart is, as the Bailey's Building and Loan Company is a pure business as opposed to the evil that Mr. Potters is. So I think that nostalgia will always remain, and I think that's what makes It's a Wonderful Life different from a lot of the movies that are sort of branded as classics right when they come out and then fall out of favor. This one had the opposite effect and is significantly benefited from that nostalgia.
Mm-hmm.
And so it looks like the audience is commenting. Kevin, you get a Santa hat. So make sure that's on your wish list for Santa if he has it. And if you only get it, remember, if you've been a good boy. So
I'll get my elves working on that right now.
Okay. All right. So White Thing, let's start with the first question we have. The first question, please. What makes this film work? I mean, we kind of use this as a general statement, but what about this film makes it work? And Ted, you were the one that did the introduction. I want to start with you again on this one. What makes this film work?
Well, what makes it work is it's so well made. I mean, I had a chance to kind of do a lot of analysis on it, watching it closely, and the pacing is just really strong. It just keeps moving from one thing to the next, So it keeps your attention that way. And then there's a thing that I noticed too, that there are all these crowds and there are all these people moving around all the time. So your eye is always moving around. There's no, the only lingering that goes on is during the love scenes between Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart, Mary and George, and that adds to the pace of it too. And then, like I said before, it's got that great kind of gimmick. I wouldn't call it gimmick. It's sort of the feature of the whole thing, of portraying, James Stewart, George Bailey being the one who keeps the town on its moral course, and if he wasn't there, the whole thing would have fallen apart. And so it makes you feel good about doing the right thing, even though through the whole movie he's very disappointed about what's going on. He's kind of self-centered about worrying about his own what he wants to do for himself, and he doesn't really see how he's affected other people in major ways. So that's how it works for me.
Well, one of the things you mentioned earlier was the pacing, and I heard about Capra. What he'd like to do is do a lot of editing in the films, in the other film, and that would cause more of the pacing. Like to capture what was the actors were doing, like you said, the just leaving the camera on Donna Reed and Jimmy Stewart during that one telephone scene, and just be able to pace it. Otherwise, the rest of the movie, clip it together as needed to be. So that's just some thoughts that I had about that. Anybody else have any comments, Kevin or Rita?
Well, it's funny that you throw out the phone scene, because they did that in one take, and they actually skipped over a full page of dialogue doing it. But Capra thought it was so brilliant that he printed that one, and they stuck that one in the final film. So pacing is a part of it. I think one of the, like Ted was talking about, that it is a very well made movie, but I think in watching it, almost 74 years since its release, but when it started to become popular in the 70s and 80s, people were able to sort of fill the cracks in the film, and I'm not saying that in a derogatory way, but just the cracks, by all of the films that they had seen Jimmy Stewart in subsequently to after It's a Wonderful Life. Similar with Donna Reed, who had a very popular television show in the 50s. So audiences could look back at everything they knew about Stewart and Reed's characters in particular, and sort of fill that up in their enjoyment of the film, because it does become a whole of their careers when you see something that's towards the beginning of both of their careers. Stewart had already won an Academy Award, but it was still the relatively early part of his career.
Rita?
Yeah, again, Ted and Kevin had hit on a lot of the remarks, and I think one of our commenters, Amy Catherine, commented on seeing the film in its whole rather than chopped up by commercials. It makes a big difference, and I think that's where the pacing comes in, and the aspects that Kevin mentioned. If you have the opportunity to see the film uninterrupted, and even better on a big screen uninterrupted, it has a much greater impact. And you appreciate more how the film does work, how it sticks together, the pacing of it. I find the dialogue interesting, the variation between the impassioned speeches that George Bailey makes when he's railing against Mr. Potter, right down to the throwaway lines that some of the characters say, which are just delightful. One of my favorite ones is, I think it's the cab driver, who he's asked, don't you have any romance in you, as they're trying to paste up the posters in the rain at the New Bailey house. And he says, yeah, I had it, but I got rid of it. And it's just a really quick line, but it's hilarious in that spot. So I appreciate the dialogue and how it holds the film together and keeps it moving along.
Yeah. All right, White Fang, another question, please. From Marilee. How you doing, Marilee? Why did they choose Buffalo Gal, Won't You Come Out Tonight? Where did that song come into play? Why did they think you picked that? Anybody on that?
I think one of the trivia items I read is that song was, in that era, that would have been that was at the high school graduation, so the late 1920s, and it was just a popular song of the time. And apparently the song was meant to go with other cities as well, but Buffalo just fit better into the notes, into the rhythm of the song. So the song became more popular with Buffalo Gal, a gal from Buffalo. It was just a timely piece that worked, and it gave the two characters opportunity to sing together and create that bond on their walk after falling in the pool.
Yeah, that's a just in itself a wonderful scene and everything else. And
That
Kevin, do you
pool
have anything
still
more on that?
exists. That pool still exists, I believe, at Beverly Hills High School. It does have the floor over it. So that's a real location that still exists. So that's.
But there are a lot of things in the film that you don't really notice too. I mean, there's a scene with Bert and Ernie where he has a newspaper and it says Smith gets the nomination, and that is, you know, what is it? I forget the name. It was just that was one of the Democrats, right? It was a Democratic nomination. But the film has all those little things in it like that, and like I pointed out, yeah. And then there's you know, Mr. Potter's office. There's a bust of Napoleon. And there are little things like that throughout the movie that just add so much to the. There's a lot of thought that went into I guess what I'm trying to say in a way is that Capra and this whole team were going at full speed when they made this movie. They really put everything they had into it, and it shows too.
So I'll make a comment on Mr. Smith wins the nomination. I hadn't seen anything about it. But also, it could have been reference back to Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. And maybe Mr. Smith, by this time, had been out long in his career. He is maybe running up to become president or something. I saw this as being, or see this as being a playback to the previous Capra movie with Jimmy Stewart. So, and it's just fun. Just like Bert and Ernie are just fun. So,
yes.
And I go back to the Buffalo Gals. Why don't you come out tonight? My dad used to sing that, and he was really always off key and off tone. He couldn't sing it, but that just keeps going through my mind. I know that song. At least my dad's version hopefully doesn't stick as much as I hear on the movie. In the movie. All right. So as we just want to remind everybody is that please comment. I see people in there. Comment, ask questions, and chat. If we're talking about a topic, put something up there. We may put you up on the include you in the part of the discussion we're talking right now. If not, post a question and we'll try to answer that. So White Fang, do we have another question? This is from Doris. Hi, Doris. I know Doris. Did any of the child actors from the movie go on to do anything else we would know?
Well, I could reverse that a little bit. In the dance scene in the high school, the guy who opens up the pool in Revenge. He was Alfalfa, right? In the you know, yeah. So that goes that way. And speaking of the young people in it, I read that when the young George got his ears boxed, and the guy actually really whacked him in real life as they were doing it, and he had blood coming out of his ears from that thing. So a little bit of realism there. Unfortunate realism.
We know that Zuzu, the child actor who plays Zuzu, was also in a film we just looked at. What was that? Was that Shadow of a Doubt? What was
The Bishop's Wife. She plays Debbie in The Bishop's Wife.
That's a
the
movie.
Little girl.
Yeah, the movie we watched. So yeah. So, but she was in A Bishop's Wife, and a lot of the people didn't go on. The kids didn't go on to do much afterwards, that I understand. Alfalfa, he just stands out to me as Alfalfa, you know. So
yeah. Apparently, there was Nabisco put out Zuzu ginger snaps.
Yes,
there's one place where George Bailey calls Zuzu my little ginger snap. So that's what the reference is.
And Zuzu is still alive. I think of all these actors, Zuzu is still alive. She's in her 80s, and but she didn't continue in acting and everything else. Actually, there's a story with her where her parents both died. She was living in Hollywood, and her parents both died like a year apart from each other, and she was like in high school. So they shipped her back to Missouri with her family, with their aunts and uncles. So she didn't really have much of a career in acting or anything after that. So
she still does appearances in support of It's a Wonderful Life around the country.
Wow.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
she'll
good.
come down here to Detroit probably every maybe 2 or 3 years.
Really?
Around Christmas time. Mm-hmm.
Oh, we should have her come up here, Kevin. You could ask her. You probably had her number, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No.
Okay. All right. So we have another question there, White Fang. What is the significance of having the raven in the building and loan? Who wants to go first on this? Kevin?
Well, again,
Ted.
it's an animal that's connected to Uncle Billy, and there's another scene in the film where in his house where there's all kinds of animals there. So it's really just I don't think it's significant in symbolic means. I did read somebody that said every time the raven shows up, something awful happens, but I couldn't put that together. The most interesting thing is the raven is apparently a famous animal in cinema history. It was Jimmy the Raven, and I read somewhere that he was in thousands of movies, and he was the pet of animal wrangler in Hollywood, and he appeared in a lot of Capra films, especially. And then there's the joke that on the set, whenever they would say, "Okay, Jimmy," and speaking to James Stewart, that the raven would respond as well too. So I'm not sure that it has any symbolic meaning. Maybe somebody else found it, but it's more characterized something to do with Uncle Billy, who's a very interesting character in this movie. That it's not at front and center all the different parts of his of what's going on with him. And there's just this, to me, one of the most astounding scenes in the whole thing is when he's crying in despair. This little squirrel goes up his shoulder and kind of consoles him. I mean, that how they got the squirrel to do that, I don't know, but it's just a throwaway. I mean, it's not mentioned in any no big deal. There's this squirrel who's a very kindly squirrel to the man that is in disgrace, you know.
No, I think Ted, you nail it there. That there really isn't. He's not a full character in that you don't know anything about him outside of the building and loan and his interaction with his family. You never go to his house or where he lives or what he does outside of the building and loan when he's not with his family. But he is the moral center of that family, and more so than George, I think, because George obviously has these aspirations that pull him away when he's younger, and then his sort of his emotional outburst before he runs off towards the before the Never Born sequence. But Uncle Billy is that pillar, that moral center of the film, and I think that his the animal thing, and you can stretch it as long as you want, but the animals do come to him. Jimmy does go to him when he comes into the office, and I think it's you look at that sort of, the animals are smarter than the humans and they know who's good and go to them. So
there's one line in there with Uncle Billy, and he said he went through the whole house, and then I even went into the Laura's room, and I haven't been into that room since she died. And it's another one of those little throwaway things that has a lot of poignancy to it, and it does give this background that he did have a wife that he apparently cared very dearly for.
Right. Yeah. So also in that scene, in Uncle Billy's house is very, very brief, and the squirrel comforting him stands out. But if you watch that scene, there are more animals, there are more pets in that house. There's a bird, there's a canary, there's a gerbil or a guinea pig, there's a dog. And so generally people who take care of animals, who have pets, are kind. And so I think that's another way to symbolize Uncle Billy's kindness.
Going back to Jimmy the Raven, or the Crow, some people call him, is that he was a raven. Is that ravens are supposed to be foretellers, like the raven, foretellers of things. And he's always appearing in this film. And I do see that. And I've read something about that, and he does, because I notice it. It's like he appears just before something bad news is going to happen or something's going to happen in the film. And he's even there when the bank is the run on the bank. He's on the counter, So I kind of agree with that. So, but Uncle Billy, he's just this lost soul. We go. You're right. A throwaway line in the movie is just that maybe his wife died. Okay.
And he's the one. They say he ended up in an insane asylum and during the nightmare sequence, which is kind of
Right.
Yes. All right. Is there any? So, with that too, is there another question we can have, White Fang?
Yeah.
Are there any interesting? This is from Scott. Hi, Scott. Are there any interesting continuity mistakes or blunders in the film, or an interesting cameo?
Mhm.
Well, I'm going to jump on this one, even though it's not a cameo, but it's one of the most interesting characters in the film, as far as I'm concerned, from an actor standpoint, and that's Gloria Graham as Violet in the film, which is one of her early films. But Gloria Graham would go on to be essentially the grand dame of film noir, appearing in more than a dozen of the greatest film noirs, including a bunch for Fritz Lang. She won an Academy Award for The Bad and the Beautiful, and she's in the few scenes that she's in, the adult Violet, I should say, really shows what she's going to become in the rest of her career, which is someone who can take a small part and make an impact in a film. Actually, her Academy Award winning performance was less than 9 minutes in the entirety of The Bad and the Beautiful, and she won Best Supporting Actress for it. She was also nominated for another role where she was only on screen for about 7 or 8 minutes. So she was a very impactful, fantastic actress. She's one of my favorites from the 40s and the 50s. And actually, they made a movie about her a couple years ago with Annette Bening, that Movie Stars Don't Die in Liverpool, which showed the end of Graham's life, tragic end to her life. But she, to me, is one of the, like, you watch films and you look for people on the periphery that become stars later. And this was certainly a star-making performance for Gloria Graham. So I don't know if that answers your question, Scott, but I can't go any longer without talking about Gloria Graham. So.
I haven't caught it, but somebody said that at some place Jimmy Stewart calls her a Gloria rather than Violet.
Oh, really? That was Jimmy Stewart's wife's name was Gloria, wasn't it?
Okay.
Double slip of the tongue there.
All right. All right. Do we have another question there, White Fang? It's from Dave. Hi, Dave. Can the panelists comment on Jimmy Stewart's acting with PTSD from his World War II pilot?
Well, let me grab this one. I could. Yes. Well, here's the thing. So Stewart had been off for 5 years while he was a pilot, as Dave mentions. He was considering moving back to Pennsylvania to take over his father's hardware store. He thought he had lost his chops in acting. His agent, Lou Wasserman, who went on to run Universal Studios and ran MCA talent agency and everything, was a mover and shaker in Hollywood. Capra called Wasserman to inquire about Stewart's availability, and Wasserman accepted for Stewart without Stewart's knowledge. Stewart was very apprehensive about doing it, so Capra moved the scene on the telephone further up into the shooting schedule because it was such an intimate movie with that kiss, intimate scene with that kiss, and that it was in very tight quarters. So it was a very emotional scene. And once Stewart did that scene, it was like getting back in the saddle again, and he was completely comfortable during the rest of the shoot. I think the movie actually is more reflective of Capra's, the impact the war had on Capra. During the war, he also was in the Army. He worked to create a series of films called the Why We Fight series. That was, I think, 7 films. And Capra he left the U.S. once during the war. He was mainly based in Los Angeles and in Washington. He went to London once early in the war. But he, in crafting those Why We Fight films, was privy to a lot of the captured films that came from our enemies during World War II. So he saw a lot of atrocities before anybody did, and probably more than anybody has ever seen in in the war atrocities during the war, and that affected him deeply. So when he left the service, he went back to Hollywood and was largely ignored in Hollywood. And he, in my mind, he always called "It's a Wonderful Life" his favorite film. And I think it's his most personal film too, because if you look at George reflects a lot of Capra's feelings at the time. There's the sacrificing for your community and then not feeling appreciated, which is what Capra felt after leaving the service. He also, Capra was very wrapped up in what other people felt about him determined his self-worth. In the 30s, he always thought he was a less than great filmmaker because he never got recognized with an Academy Award. He ended up winning 3 Academy Awards in the 30s. But until then, he never felt any self-worth. And I think that also reflects in George. This really reflects Capra more than it does anybody else. It is his most personal film, like I said. But I think a lot of people coming out of World War II felt this way. And Ted, if you want to talk too about, the best years of our lives, which came out at the same time and was a much bigger hit because it dealt with it more realistically. But I think there's definitely impacts from the war.
Just related to this question, though, I see what you're talking about here is that this is very cathartic for both Stewart and Capra. Stewart thought he'd just retire and go work the hardware store from his dad after his experience in doing all this stuff. And Capra wanted to get back in, and doing this brought them both back to life. But even though it wasn't a popular film, and we could discuss why that's not a popular film. We want to do that right now. We could do that. That would be a very good thing to say, is that why wasn't this such a popular film if these two gentlemen had so much in it? And it was very cathartic for them as former people in the military. Why did they not win the Academy Awards that the best years of our lives did? So Ted, do you want to approach that?
Well, one thing, apparently, you talked about Lou Wasserman, but apparently Lionel Barrymore had a chat with James Stewart and said, you're a good actor and you can do a lot more for people by being a good actor than you can by doing other things. And that kind of encouraged James Stewart to do the role. The other thing I'd say, getting back to the PS, that there are times in this movie where Stewart acts incredibly hysterical. I mean, he's really out of. It's really hard to watch sometimes that he's so intense with that, and I would have to think that had something to do with some feelings coming up from the war experience. Now, getting to this question why it wasn't popular, I've been thinking about that, and I think part of it is because it was just really the studio didn't know what to do with it exactly. It was released in December of '46 in order for the Academy Awards, but it didn't become in the public a wide release until the 7th of January. And apparently there was a lot of bad weather. So, and then you see the fact that the publicity about the film was that it was this feel-good movie between Donna Reed and James Stewart. But then you go to the credits and there's all this Christmas, symbolism in the around the corners of the screen. So it seems to me that it just didn't make a whole lot of sense what this movie was about. They didn't know how to sell it, for one thing. But the other thing was that the reviews in the day said it was so sentimental and so Capricorn, as they called it, that people weren't really open to that kind of thing right after the war. And then you had this film, the Best Years of Our Life, which is kind of a melancholy film about these men actually addressing the men coming back from the war and all the things that they had to face. I was thinking it'd be a very long double bill, but it would be kind of interesting to see the two back to back, since they they released at exactly the same time. And and the other thing about the best years of our life is that one of the main actors, Russell so and so, he actually had lost both his hands, and so that kind of thing really did that really was a hard hitting thing to watch. It still is, and that kind of fit the mood of the people back then. They weren't real. That's what I can explain. That's the way I could say.
All right. I think the next question we get here, White Fang, can you pull up the question from Jimmy here? I think we need to get on this topic. Jimmy, thank you for posting this, because it's something we've all talked about. Can we discuss why this is not a Christmas movie? Ted, you started out and you presented something in the your introduction, talked about it a bit. But Rita, you've been quiet for a while. Can we have you discuss why you don't think this is not a Christmas movie?
Yeah, actually, I turned the question around and say, is this a Christmas movie? And I think people might mistake it for that because it was released around Christmas time. When the original release dates was right in like the 20th of December, but as Ted pointed out, they had to push it out a little bit. And it takes place initially, the very, very beginning and the very end is on Christmas Eve, and then the Christmas symbolism in the opening credits. But I would argue it is not a Christmas film at all. The only reason why it's thought of as a Christmas film to us as we watch it now in modern times is that this crisis around which the whole story turns, the Bailey building and loan not finding their $8,000, that's what gets the story going. And because it's on Christmas Eve, when emotions and feelings are heightened in general anyway, that's just where the crisis just happens to happen. But I would say it is not a Christmas movie at all. It's just that over time, that's when it's been shown, and now we start to believe it is a Christmas movie, which is very interesting when you think about it that way too. That a non-Christmas movie becomes a Christmas film that we watch at Christmas time. But I'm sure there are others out there too, like
Die Hard. Die Hard.
Yes, just happens to take place on Christmas, but it is not a Christmas movie.
Kevin, what do you think?
Well, I love this question because I agree with its sentiment completely. I don't think it's a Christmas movie either. I think it takes place, on Christmas, but it's really not about that. You can talk about the sentiment of the Christmas season as one of the, sort of the harbingers of why this was chosen to be played, year in and year out around Christmas. But I guess you can sort of draw two camps to that, right? There's Christmas movies that are actually about Christmas, whether it's the commercial version or the religious version, but it's about Christmas itself. Then there's the Christmas adjacent movies where they take place on or around Christmas. And I think this is a Christmas adjacent movie in that it takes place on or around Christmas, but it's not necessarily a Christmas movie. I love the question.
So it's another question. I'll just pop this up, White Fang. I'm just going to do this because Linda Wessels. Hi, Linda. How are you doing? So what kind of movie would you say it is then? If it's not a Christmas movie, what is it?
It's a Frank Capra movie.
Yeah.
So what makes a Frank Capra movie? That's a good point, because what makes a Frank Capra movie? Because part of the reason I believe is that he made this as a Frank Capra movie, and it was already past World War II. Understand, people had been through 2 World War wars, a major Spanish flu epidemic. They're actually in the middle now after this war with the polio epidemic going on. But the point is that he was making a movie like Capra liked to make movies before the war, and Best Years of Our Lives was related to after the war, and people wanted to grow from there instead of worry about their feelings anymore. They wanted to just be joyous and move forward. That's my thoughts on it. So, but what kind of movie is it then?
I agree with Ted. It's a Capra movie through and through. Like I said, this is his most personal movie, reflects him. I like Jimmy's comment here that it is about the totality of one man's life, not just an instant. And the interesting thing for me about this is how close. I always say that it's a very fine line between order and chaos. And the order at the building and loan, the difference between order and chaos was that one envelope that Billy lost at the bank. And that spirals George's life, his feelings about his life, down to where he contemplates jumping off that bridge. So I think that, it is about the totality of his existence. And that's what Clarence shows him, not just how it will impact this one Christmas, but the totality of his life impacts. It's the ripple effect that our lives have with those we know.
So what other Capra films would this be like then? If it's like a Capra film, it's Capra.
Guess what? The movie a few movies before, Meet John Doe, the main character, the Gary Cooper character, on Christmas Eve, he's ready to jump off the building. I mean, you talk about a personal thing. You just wonder what Frank Capra did on Christmas Eve, but I wouldn't know. But I mean, it's kind of interesting that same exact situation shows up. I was going to say something else, but I've lost the thought. So,
well, I mean, you can really see in Capra, it's these overwhelming forces that attempt to grind down his lead characters. In Mr. Smith, it's obviously the political machine. In Meet John Doe, it's the newspapers and then the crowds that turn on him, that grind him down, where he contemplates suicide at the end. In this case, it's economics that grind George down. It's class distinction that grinds George down. His friend Wainwright obviously is college grad, has everything handed to him through his father. So there's those class struggles that are evident throughout this, but it really does reflect back to all of Capra's films, that there's some force that's trying to grind down his leading character, and how they react is sort of the story of those films.
The struggle of the common man.
Yeah,
this is a side point. Mr. Potter successfully keeps the $8,000. He never gives it back, so he steals the money. And even at the end of the movie, he still has his bank. I mean, he hasn't been overthrown. It's just that the attitudes of the people of James Stewart has changed. That he sees his self-worth, and maybe that's the big Capra theme is a man going through incredible problems and situations, and in the end he sees that he sees his own self-worth, something like that. And the other thing, there's also a woman involved. There's also the woman that saves him along the way too.
Yes.
So it comes back to this movie. It seems like is that we have one episode here where there you go. Sorry, we have one episode where it all comes down to this one time in the bank where Billy makes a mistake, and it all comes tumbling down. But before this, it was all a movie about how good George was and all the things going on and how he was saving the town. And this one instance happened, and you go to Mr. Smith in Washington, it's the same similar thing, and a lot of the Capra movies. So it's very Capra-esque. But how would you categorize as a Capra film? I think yes. Is it a drama? I think it's a drama more than it is anything else. I don't know about you guys, how you feel about this. It's a drama. It's not a comedy. So, crickets? Okay.
Well, I'll jump in here. It is a drama, but I think what the power of the film is, it shows an ordinary person, and a lot of time is spent in the film as Clarence is getting acquainted with George Bailey, just showing the ordinariness of his life. And going back to what Kevin said about being ground down and having circumstances beyond your control feel like they're grinding you down. And I think a lot of average people feel that way from time to time because they think their life is just plain and boring, and it's the stuff you have to do every day. But in the end, the lesson we learn through this film is that even that everyday boring stuff is important because it's all the glue that holds everyone together. And every common person's boring life combined as a whole makes the community. It makes the community work, and you support each other. And we have to, every once in a while, I think Mary Lee said that, every once in a while we have to start thinking about those things. And maybe that's another reason why this film is good at Christmas time, because it is a time of reflection. We're coming to the end of the year and facing a new year. And it's good to sit down and think about all the things that we have done and how it has influenced our communities, whether we are conscious of it or not. We know that back to the ripple effect that someone mentioned, it's all worthwhile. There are things happening constantly, even if they seem very plain and ordinary.
And Jimmy kind of comes back to this thing, wrap this up a little bit. Do you think other movies take the idea of revisiting your life to show what you've missed or how you influenced others, like Scrooge? And that's something like this time of year, we're getting towards the end of the year, we're trying to reflect on our families and our friends, especially during this year. We're thinking a lot about stuff like that, okay? And so when we look at all this stuff, this film is a Capra film, and Capra was really good at talking about that, the struggles of the common man, and the thoughts and what can go on about the common man, not something glorified or a drama or anything else. It was really about other people that aren't real, can seem real, but these characters seem really real. Mm-hmm. So anyways, all right, do we have another question there, White Fang? We've only got a few more minutes left here. Amy, hi Amy. Can we talk about how funny Clarence was? Oh yes, let's do that. He was a hoot. Also, didn't notice the homophobia Nick, the bartender, exhibited when he threw George and Clarence out. Who wants to talk about Clarence here? Rita?
Clarence was wonderful. Clarence Oddbody. It's right from the very beginning when you meet him just as that little star talking with the two other angels. And he's amusing. And I think because he's been out of the loop, so to speak, he's been dead for how many 100 years, and he's toting Tom Sawyer's book around. He's serious because he has his job to do. He really wants to earn his wings, and he sincerely wants to help George Bailey find the way out of his dilemma. But he does have some really good lines there, and he's a trooper. He comes through for George, and then because of that, he earns his wings.
Well, also, he probably relates to George because apparently up in heaven, he has seen, well, he's a second-class angel,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
but everyone was disparaging of, oh no, it's Clarence's turn. Oh no. But there's another part to this, and this is the structure of the film. At the beginning of the film, we're supposed to be watching George's life as a movie that's presented to Clarence.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting. It starts off that way, and then it just they never follow up on it. Really, the movie just takes off, and Clarence shows up. Mm-hmm. But the other interesting part about Clarence seeing the early part of his life is that he knows that if he jumps in the water, George Bailey's going to go get him, because that's what happened when he did his brother. Right. And so there's kind of this interesting loop there, but you don't realize that, there's a little bit at the beginning where the movie's out of focus and it gets into focus, and it's sort of like we're watching the movie, like the angels watching the movie. Mm-hmm. And then we, like we always do in good Hollywood movies, is we get completely lost in the story. We don't think about it anymore, and that's what classic film does in Hollywood. And Capra's a genius at it. Of we just get completely lost in the story, and we really don't think too much about about exactly what's the moral and all this kind of stuff. We care about the characters and that kind of thing. And then I'd like to throw another interesting. There's a little documentary in the middle of it when George can't go off to war. There's this really little interesting documentary about people at home on the home front, saving the tires, and he's a civil defense guy and that kind of thing. But that uses documentary film there to show what the home front was like, and it's interesting how this film has all these different little pieces to it, and you don't really it doesn't really strike you because you're so caught up in the way it's presented.
Well, I think that little documentary thing is, considering when this was released right after the war, there had to be, I think, a hard rationalization of why George wouldn't have fought. Right. So there's that explanation of, okay, he's got the bum ear, but this is what he did on the home front during the war to not, diminish his character, as a person for not having served his country in the best way, which was in the military. But I go back to the question about Clarence, and I love the supernatural beings, those overseers in heaven, the two clouds that speak about Clarence, and they say he has the IQ of a rabbit and the faith of a child.
Mm-hmm.
Which I think if everybody went through life that way, it wouldn't be too bad if everybody was like that, right? But it can't be that way. That's the idealized nature of the goodness inherent in all of us. But then our IQ, our subconscious, takes over, and half of us become Potter and half of us become George, or some sort of ratio within that. But Clarence is the purity of what humans could strive for in some way, shape, or form. So,
and since we were almost done, just remember that they got the only Academy Award this movie got was for the special effects, and apparently it was a big deal the way they made the snow, it being made out of foam like that and being blown up to make it look like real snow. Because before then, they used cornflakes. And when people would walk on it, it would make a big crunchy sound. And sometimes they had to redo the dialogue because of that kind of. And Capra was an engineer, so he probably helped out in making this whole thing happen too.
Yeah, I mean, if you see him here in this picture, as the set, he was really big into snow making. He wanted to make it snow. He didn't want to have the crunchy stuff, and he wanted to use the snow as part of the movie, and it works really well. For those of you who have never been to Sutton's Bay up in the wintertime, please come up here. It's just wonderful. Or maybe not, please come up here. We're enjoying ourselves up here. But if you come up here to Sutton's Bay, is that I remember being up here a couple years ago, and I put something on Instagram, took a picture because the snow was out, the snow was fresh coming down, the street was filled, and all the Christmas lights were up. If you come to Sutton's Bay right now, all the Christmas lights, they have trees decorated, all the places, the buildings, and the Bay Theater itself is all lit up with a big strand of lights coming off of it. So it's really like going to Bedford Falls up here. And so every time I see this movie, I think of Sutton's Bay, just to let you know. So
Ted, I go back to that. Very well said, Larry, by the way. The Chamber of Commerce will be slipping you something in your stocking this year.
Yeah.
But Ted, I go back to the creation of the snow, and it was a combination of shaved ice, but they were doing it in a heat wave, so that didn't last very long. Mm-hmm. And then they used gypsum, which I imagine would be gypsum powder, and then something called foamite, which I can't imagine was made naturally or out of anything natural. So I wonder, having created the beautiful snow scenes that they did, what was the long-term health impact on those who worked for 5 weeks in that, that snowy area when they're blowing around gypsum powder, which I couldn't imagine could be good for anybody, and then foamite. So yes, it was one leap forward for special effects, but probably 3 leaps back for the general health of the crew. So,
all right. We're getting down there. We got one more general question, then we'll have to go to the last question. What general question, White Fang, do we have? Are you a Potter or are you George? Good framing for life. Yes, Amy, that's very good. Yep. We have another question there we can talk about for about 3 minutes.
Well, I'll answer that question first. Is like, I want to be George, but I wouldn't mind if Potter were my
best friend,
retirement planner. Yeah, exactly.
I guess I'm always a George. I'm always the George, and you have to watch out for the Potters, okay? And Potter, the only way he survives the Big Depression is by what? Having cash, and that's just if you learn anything from this movie about money management, the way to survive a depression or a major recession is having a lot of cash, because that's how Potter survived. So,
there's one other thing. The FBI watched this movie.
Yes,
and they thought Potter was being portrayed as some sort of awful banker that he was portrayed as evil, and this was bad. This was a communist propaganda that they would portray a banker this way. And you think I'm kidding? There really is a memo that says this kind of thing, and so. That's crazy stuff. But,
it was one of the trivia items I read is that the capitalist was portrayed as a bad person. That capitalism was bad, And it just made me chuckle. It's like, well, it's just one bad capitalist. That doesn't mean they're all bad capitalists. But this one wasn't too nice.
It was one of the things that affected Capra leading into this was that when the script started going around, it was deemed that had some negative anti-capitalist things, and he was, he had the FBI filed open on him, and he was under investigation for communist activity. And actually, I want to get the name right of this organization, called the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals. And they impacted this movie because at the time, anyone who was suspected of communism had to go to the alliance for approval, essentially, on who they were going to cast. And Ward Bond, who plays Bert, the cop, was good friends with John Wayne. And ironically enough, John Wayne was the head of the alliance. Now think about that. John Wayne is one of the few actors in Hollywood who never served in the military. Yet he was dictating who was a communist and who was not a communist post World War II. So Capra and his agent, or not his agent, but one of his producers, went to Wayne and said, we've got the script, we want to do it. And he said, well, use Ward Bond then, because Ward Bond, Bert in the movie, was one of Wayne's buddies, and he was also a hardcore anti-communist. So that diffused any initial blowback that they got for making this film with the evil banker and the communist tendencies about the building and loan being all for one, and we all risk this together. But the alliance, a dark spot in American
garlic
history.
eaters.
What's that?
The garlic eaters.
Yeah. Oh well, that goes to all the different class distinctions, especially in the Never Born sequence, where Martini, who George helps get the home, which Capra, as an American-born immigrant, he felt a very strong affinity towards immigrants, and when he turned that negatively, then it goes to the extreme where Potter calls them garlic eaters, and it just shows that dichotomy between George and Potter, and like Amy put out there, are you a George or are you a Potter? And the garlic eater line, and there's a couple other ones. She alluded to sort of the homophobia of Nick with George and Clarence when he's tossing them out of the bar too. So there's all sorts of that undercurrent in that.
Apparently, when they filed into the call,
let's get down to our last question here, folks.
Oh, okay.
Oh, does that hurt you? Sorry. I have to remember not to do this so close. Now that I have a bell to ring, this is kind of cool. So let's get the last question here, White Fang. Thanks. Because we're running out of time here. We tell people it'll be an hour. So just kind of, this is a question for all of you, not just the panelists, but I'd like you to think about this question. Post comments if you want to as we're leaving here. But what do you take away from this film? We've talked a lot about this at different points today. And what is the moral of the story? What do you take away when you leave? How are you feeling? What do you take away? What do you think about? And who would like to start? Rita?
Sure, I'll start. Well, the first obvious lesson to take away at the very, very end is the inscription in the book that Clarence leaves for George. Remember, George, no man is a failure who has friends. And I know for me, that is the line that always chokes me up at the end of the film, and I get a little weepy because I know that's really important. But also earlier in Clarence's sequence, he says, each man's life touches so many others. When he isn't around, he leaves an awful hole, doesn't he? And I think that's just a good reminder as we reflect on the years that each of us touches many, many people in positive ways. Sometimes we won't even know what effect we've had on them or what impact we've had on them. But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, that your presence here on the earth does affect many, many other people.
Ted, what do you think is?
Oh, I could go on about a lot of things, but I think part of it, what I noticed looking and examining at this time was the fact that James Stewart was kind of through most of the movie is self-absorbed, worrying about himself and that kind of thing. And once he realizes that he's part of the bigger picture, he feels he becomes more comfortable with himself and with the people around him. And so it has to do with kind of self-awareness, that kind of thing.
How about you, Kevin?
No, I think I think those 2 points are nail it on both sides, because I wish we'd gotten to the point when George is um, courting his ultimate wife, supposedly, and he is a jerk. He's a completely self-absorbed jerk. And Ted's exactly right. It's looking at the bigger picture and how you impact in the grand scheme of things.
Mm-hmm.
And as we have to round up here, and I think all those things, we all take away from movies different things. And we appreciate everybody being here tonight. But as you see in this picture, one of the last final shots there of the family and the people all together, it is all about the family. It's about the people you know. And you all have to take some time every once in a while to remember that and to move forward based on that. And I think that as we see this, we want to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, everything. But before we go ahead and do that, let's remind everybody, oh, I went too far ahead here. Okay, let's go and we'd like to ask everybody, if you can, subscribe to the Bay Theater. We've gone up to 102 subscriptions now. And also when you subscribe, actually, please put notifications so we can let you know when we're coming out with our next videos and our next sessions. In addition to that, we're going to have 2 in January. We're going to have Singing in the Rain and The Bandwagon, 2 movie musicals based about the industry, and the entertainment industry. Singing in the Rain is about movie making, and The Bandwagon is about theaters. And this is both films from the 50s, and we hope to have you come back, and we're going to compare these 2 films and talk about them. Please get a chance to watch them. We'll be coming out, Kevin and Ted will be putting out introductions to these movies as we get into January. And before we get to January, we wanted to wish everybody a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Stay safe, be healthy, and we'll see you in the new year. Thank you, everybody. Merry Christmas.
Bye-bye.